Hello, welcome. I'm Rob Doubleday, Executive Director of the Centre for Science and Policy at the university here, and welcome to this session on the final day of the Alum Festival this year. And it's great to welcome so many of you to this discussion on climate change and the economy, what COP26 needs to know. And we're joined by Cristina Peñasco, who's the Director of the Masters for Public Policy, which is held in Polis, and she's also a Fellow of the Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance and Land Economy. Cristina, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
And Matthew Agarwala, who is the lead on the Bennett Institute's Wealth Economy project. And both Matthew and Cristina are economists interested in the question about climate change and the kinds of transitions that we need to see. Cristina specialises in innovation policy and energy technologies, and Matthew on the sort of measurement questions about how we know whether we're going in the right direction in terms of climate and sustainability. So in this session, I'm going to start by asking Cristina and Matthew a couple of questions, and then we really encourage you to put your questions, which will appear in front of me here on this screen. So if you use the Q&A function to put your questions, I will put those to Cristina and Matthew. So with that, I will start by asking perhaps Matthew first. So we're looking ahead to this big international conference in Glasgow in November. Really kind of, where are we? What's at stake when this meeting takes place?
Well, Rob, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you everybody at home for joining us for this, I think, quite important and exciting discussion. It's a great question. What is really at stake? Why does this one matter? It's the 26th COP. Is the 26th one going to be the charm? Well, let's think about this for a moment. We've seen GDP growth and economic progress over the past 120 years that has transformed the human condition. Increases in literacy rates, access to food, decreases in infant mortality and preventable childhood diseases. But alongside that, we've seen 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 released into the atmosphere. And that is creating mounting environmental pressures that threaten to wipe out an entire century worth of economic progress. Right now, the world stands on a precipice. We have seen the impacts of the COVID pandemic, which come from the degradation of nature and biodiversity loss. We now are about to see, and have already begun in Europe, in China, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, to see extreme weather events that are driving loss of life, loss of welfare, and loss of human well-being. We have a chance at the moment to invest in a different kind of economic future. If there's one key point to get across today, it's that we will receive the future that we build. We will get the future we invest in now. There's a chance to reorient the economy, and there's a public demand for doing so. Following the COVID pandemic, we need to make this one a green recovery.
So that's looking ahead to kind of what's at stake. And where are we now in terms of, I mean, do you agree with Matthew? And to the extent you do, where are we now in rising to that challenge?
Thanks, Rob, for the question. I mean, I think Matthew has stated very clearly the overview of the problems that we are facing and the situation that we will have ahead. The COP26 arrives in a moment in which there's no room for hesitation. I mean, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change has stated very clearly that unless we put in place some reductions and we reach reductions in the following decades in GHG emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions, and in CO2 emissions, we will not be able to keep global warming under 1.5, 2 degrees. So this is basically what it at stake. The main problem or the trickiest question here is that with COP26, with the Paris Agreement signed in 2015, the pledges and the targets that countries made in that meeting are not enough to lead the future into that direction. we are in a future with those pledges that will allow us an increase in global warming around 2.4 degrees, but not well below 2 degrees. Right now, it's good. We have around, I think it is 60 countries that have put in law or in policy documents targets, carbon net zero targets for most of the cases 2050. There are advances in conversations and discussions on other targets, also carbon neutral targets for other 70 countries, I think it is, but this is far away from the goals, and we need policies to reach those targets. If you allow me the analogy, the target is the destination, the policy is the mean we use to reach that destination, and there's no clarity on those policies. So I think there is a lot of room in COP, and this is where we are now, in deciding which are the policies we are going to put in place to reach those targets and make them more stringent, because if we don't make them more stringent, we are not going to be able to keep the global warming unless the well below the 2 degrees.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that, there's potentially the means there to rise to the challenge that Matthew talked about, but we're still not sure whether countries are really committing themselves to those kinds of policies that are likely to get where we need to go. Is
exactly.
That what
Right now, I think it's 70% of the global economy has committed to targets. It's a lot, but only around 24 of these 60 that I mentioned have put in place some roadmaps to reach that targets. Roadmaps with some policies, but not the concrete instruments that will allow us to reach not only these decarbonization objectives, but also keep inequality levels, improve socioeconomic conditions, improve the economy competitiveness, reduce distributional impacts, and so on. And we are in a moment in which countries need to balance these two things, as mentioned, as Matthew mentioned before, because of the green recovery that we are trying to pursue.
So just to be clear, which two things need to be balanced?
Sustainability and environmental issues, and competitiveness and distributional issues. There is a trade-off always between these two objectives, but we know there are policies and policy instruments that will allow us to transform these trade-offs into co-benefits, so we get a win-win solution, better environment and better economic or socioeconomic conditions for the citizens.
Right. So,
I think there's quite a bit of opportunity and space for some win-wins. Yes, there can be times when there is an unavoidable trade-off between achieving environmental goals and achieving what we used to think of as pure economic objectives, growing GDP or enhancing competitiveness. But the reality is that because of many of the kinds of things we need to do to reduce emissions, because those are investments, because those are going to drive new innovation in technology and infrastructure, but also in business models and skills and the way we train people and what we train them in, there are chances to ensure that as we go forward, we build in competitiveness. And what we've seen so far with the renewables revolution is that, yes, 15 years ago, it looked like a Herculean or perhaps even Sisyphean task. But what we've seen over the past decade is the price of renewables dropping by 85%. The price of battery storage doing something very similar. That only happened because of deliberate, targeted policy interventions to provide subsidies early on for the first movers to start investing in and increasing the efficiency of renewables like solar and wind. Once they did that, we learned by doing. We got better and better at it. And that's a hugely important process. We just need to replicate that all the way across the economy.
Yeah, because Cristina, the title of our talk here is what does COP need to know? So you as an economist that look at these kinds of innovation pathways and the economics of innovation, can you take the kind of insights that Matthew mentions and think about how to translate that into actionable kind of knowledge that governments can use?
This is what we are actually trying to do these days in a project with, it's called energy, well, I will remember how it's called. Economics for Energy Innovation and System Transitions. So actually, we like to talk about these issues of how technologies have reduced cost enormously, but the models that governments or supranational organizations use to make predictions about the impacts of different policies in socioeconomic indicators, in environmental economic indicators, have not been able to predict these clear reductions. They have been underestimated all this reduction in cost. And at the same time, therefore, they are not able to see the growth opportunities, the economic opportunities derived from innovation. Technological change has been huge during the last decades, and models haven't predicted that. With policies in the ground, we've seen there has been a reduction. So what we are now trying to disentangle is how we can make these models better so in the future they are more accurate and they allow us to predict in a clearer way this technological change, this huge technological change. At the same time, what we have to mention is that this underestimation of innovation has shown higher costs than the ones we are going to be facing in the future. Yeah. So the transition, it's going to be cheaper than what models has predicted. It's always, when I get any question about this, like this is not very, very expensive just to transition to low carbon economies, and it's less expensive than what we think it is because models have underestimated these benefits from innovation.
Could you give I just want to ask Cristina a sort of concrete example. So could you kind of give an example of a technology that has proved cheaper than the models predicted? And then what are the implications for what you want to see governments do differently?
Solar PV is the clearest example. It's the technology that has reduced their cost the highest during the last decades. Some years ago, it was impossible to think that was going to be a possibility, and we are seeing the technology is basically as cheap as and a competitor with other type of former ways of producing electricity. So that's the clear technology that we've seen has reduced their cost, and all the policies that have been put in place, feed-in tariffs, for example, are the instruments that have allowed us to reduce this cost, and this hasn't been modeled accurately, let's say, in the last years.
You're really making some very key points here. The one that must be underlined and just everybody needs to remember is that the economic models of the past have not been able to predict the precipitous drop in the price of renewables. And that's because the kinds of innovation have come so much quicker than any of us could have anticipated. Nobody would have thought, sitting back in 1995 or even 2000, that we would go 6 months without coal-generated energy in the UK, and we've done that. That's a huge transformation. The challenge, the question for COP is, will the leaders and the 30,000 negotiators and experts, and including, I think, us who are going to be there, be able to demonstrate that there's a commitment to making sure that happens in every sector. We need to do this in buildings, right? Buildings are 40% of emissions. The materials that we use. We need to do it in clothing and fashion. We need to do it in food and transport. We need to do it in online media and cryptocurrencies. We need to decarbonize right across the economy. We've got some examples that this can work. And now, as you say, renewables, they compete and out-compete against fossil fuels in most parts of the world.
I mean, we've got lots of great questions already. Thank you for putting so many questions. I can see we're not going to get to all of them. But I do want to turn to some of these questions in a moment. But before we do, final sort of question around the kind of, how to bring people with this agenda, and that relates partly to equality and the kind of opportunities that this sort of new society, new economy will offer people. I mean, maybe you could talk about these. You referred to them as distributional questions. I mean, we're familiar with, really exciting technological innovation that can end up kind of apparently increasing inequality or increasing inequality of opportunities for people. How do we tackle the kind of pro-innovation policies that are needed in combination with questions about kind of social justice and equality?
So one of the things I think to keep in mind is that we cannot afford climate inaction, not only because of environmental reasons, but because inaction is more expensive than putting in place the carbonization policy scenarios. It's true, I'm not gonna lie, that we are being seen in evidence. Evidence says that there are some kind of short-term distributional issues that we have to solve because certain segments of the populations are gonna be more affected by temporary increases in cost that we may be seeing. That's true, but we have the instruments to make them better and to make them better off. So I'm thinking, for example, if I ask you what is the first policy instrument that comes to your mind, you probably will say carbon taxes. Well, it's true that carbon taxes, what we see in the evidence is that they will affect more people in rural areas because they have to use the car more, they have to displace more distances or longer distances, they have less access to public transport. How can we make these people better if we are going to increase a carbon tax that will affect them the most? Well, we have to create a recycling mechanism that makes them compensate with other type of taxes and an income rebate or something like that, so they don't feel the government wants just to increase their incomes at the expense of the poorest one in the society.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just noting that Cristina actually led an international study on the various kinds of climate policies that are available and their trade-offs with respect to inequality. And that is available, I think it's an open access article.
It's an open access tool.
From the #1 climate journal in the world, Nature Climate Change. And we have a blog about it on the Bennett Institute's website, so please do check that out.
And following that, Matthew, I mean, looking at it from a sort of macro fiscal kind of point of view, do you see that governments, as we know, have taken on huge amounts of debt? Is there a chance that governments can help manage this transition in an equitable way? What would you say from the point of view of the
so
work
there are a few quick points to be made here. Basically, there's a lot of learning still to be done in finance ministries and central banks around the world. They are working on it. We have the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a group of central bankers. We have the Coalition of Finance Ministers also working on climate change. So there's interest, but there's still a huge amount of learning to be done. What do they need to know? There are two types of climate costs. One is the kind of cost that gives us a long-term, positive, beneficial return. That's an investment. It's investing in a decarbonized transport and infrastructure system. That means we will have lower cost energy, lower cost transportation, better air quality, and a healthier population as a result. Those are all long-term benefits. The other kind of climate cost has no upside. It's only downside risks. It's the loss of life. It's the destruction of property. It's the loss of financial wealth that comes, and we've seen it around the world, from extreme weather events. And what we've seen this past year is very much the appetizer course, if we were to think about what climate change could deliver if we don't reduce emissions. There's no way, though, to deliver the kind of investment that we need purely on public borrowing. The public borrowers, the finance ministries and the central banks, they need to crowd in private sector investment. And that's the way, leveraging the private sector investment, where the real financial wealth is held, that can provide the investment to deliver net zero. The fact is that climate change is going to make public borrowing harder if we don't do this. It's going to make public borrowing, what we pay on our national debt, is going to go up if we do not reduce our emissions now. And the reason for that is when we don't reduce our emissions, the economy is going to be battered by climate change, and as a result, we will produce less, and we will be less able to repay our debt. If you're not able to pay your debt, you're a higher credit risk. A higher credit risk has to pay more to borrow. The cheapest way the only way, is to invest in decarbonization now.
This will exacerbate inequalities as well across countries. I mean, it's not only a national issue. The thing what you mentioned before about vulnerability of different countries to extreme events, we shouldn't forget that most of the countries, or the countries that are going to be more vulnerable to these extreme events, are countries in the global south. We have countries like Kenya, we have countries like Rwanda. India is one of the countries that will be facing the highest number of extreme events. So this will create more inequalities among countries and also within countries, because those ones in the highest segments of the population, of the income levels, will be able to adapt in a better way than those ones in the lowest segments of the income levels. So
that's true, but let's remember, nobody gets a free ride. Nobody can escape this. People in New York died last month as a result of hurricanes. People in Texas, this is a wealthy country, the United States. People in Texas died over the winter because it got cold. I mean, not that cold, right? It was barely below freezing. But because Texas's infrastructure isn't ready for those sorts of temperatures, it was fatal in the wealthiest country in the world.
I mean, we really do have so many great questions. I mean, I suggest we just try and address as many of them as we can. So it's kind of rapid fire. But I mean, you know, when you feel like you want to kind of take longer, please do. But I'm just going to take, you know, these roughly in the order that they come. So the first one deals with divestment. So I might put this to you first, Matthew. So this is from Gareth, how do we encourage governments, businesses, other institutions to divest rapidly from fossil fuel? You know, what's your response to that question?
Sure, it's an extremely controversial topic, and Cambridge is no stranger to such controversy.
But it's the first question, so let's go for it.
So my view is that divestment is not a particularly effective strategy. If you leave your seat at the table, your ability to change what happens in major emitting companies falls. What's important, what I think are some of the biggest tectonic shifts in the financing of fossil fuels, is when we have shareholder resolutions at these fossil fuel majors that are changing the way they do business. Shareholder resolutions say we must have a net zero plan. Shareholder resolutions which say we must demonstrate what our business plan is and our outlook is under a 2-degree carbon world, or a 2-degree centigrade world, and a 1.5-degree centigrade world.
But presumably, you know, that is, you know, in addition to government action that's needed to regulate and structure the market.
But divesting out of tobacco didn't stop the world's smoking habit. I'm not sure that divesting out of fossil fuels is the right way to go.
Great. Well, as you said, that is a topic that lots of people have, you know, lots of good but divergent opinions on. But I'm going to keep going. So another question, which I'll put to you from Keith, is put to you, Cristina, is really around implementation. So we've talked about, you know, the moment. We've talked about the possibility for positive change. We've talked about, you know, better measures, better understanding of policies. But now what about implementation? How do we monitor and kind of push for the proper implementation of these policies?
We need political will, of course, but we always, I think, one of the, I would say, mistakes that we'll always keep in mind is that the best solutions come always from the top. And sometimes we should think of local jurisdictions, regional jurisdictions, to start implementing from the bottom. So I think it's very important, in order to implement these policies, conversation and communication and cooperation, the tragedy of the commons and how to solve it with cooperation, between and within jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a dialogue with local governments, with regional governments, also national, of course, and we are talking about the COP, so negotiations, in order to reach the ground. Because local jurisdictions tend to know better people and tend to know better what people need, infrastructure, parks. They have been working in the Bennett Institute as well about in projects related to public infrastructure and parks from the bottom. So I think it's very important, in order to implement, to get engaged with local and regional governments.
Yeah. Can I just add that
Yeah, go for it.
For those interested, you may have seen it on BBC Newsnight with our colleague Tom Kelsey a couple of days ago. There is a report on social infrastructure available on the Bennett website, which talks specifically about these issues.
Yeah. So I think this is a good question for you, Matthew, I predict. So this comes from Rhiannon. So it says, is it a given that GDP must always grow? It seems that unending growth on a finite planet with finite resources can't be possible without either the planet or people losing out. Discuss.
Thank you for the question, Rhiannon. That is very near and dear to my heart. And I think the reason that I was hired here at Cambridge, so by Cristina, by the way. There's a raging debate in economics about whether we should be trying to grow GDP or shrink it, the degrowth side of the argument. My view is that GDP misses the point entirely. GDP is the income flow. If you were to take a look at just the income flow, the revenue statements of, say, Thomas Cook in the year that it collapsed, it had about £9 billion in revenue, which is pretty big. But you would miss entirely what's going on in the balance sheet, that £4 billion hole that they had, and that's why they collapsed. GDP is the income flow of a nation. We need to look to what's happening in the balance sheet of nations, and that is referred to as inclusive wealth. It's the stock of human capital, physical, natural, and social capital that countries have at their disposal. And I think you should read Partha Dasgupta's work on this, and particularly this year, his Treasury review on the economics of biodiversity.
So if I can follow up, I think it's very important in that sense to take into account that it's not GDP, but how we grow with the welfare of the people. I mean, we have an agenda. It's not only about decarbonization or of the economies. We have an agenda with 2017 Sustainable Development Goals that take into consideration all these issues. It's not only growing, it's generating innovation, creating infrastructure, circular economy, help SMEs, and all that will contribute. And I will come back to something that I have here from Matthew a couple of times. The bigger the pie is, the more we can redistribute it. So that's something to take into consideration. But it's, as he said, it's about how we grow and how we make people better off this world.
Cristina, I'm going to put a question to you that I know will be at the heart of discussions in COP in Glasgow, and that is really around the balance between more and less developed countries. So Esther writes, how should COP26 address the issue of responsibilities of developing versus developed countries when it comes to combating climate change? And obviously this question, goes through everything, but I mean, maybe you'd like to address it in respect of sort of technology and innovation and capacity building.
I mean, I would like to have an answer to that, and I could be there and say, you can solve the Article 6, which is all about this discussion in this way. I don't have an answer, but it's going to be the debate, how we can implement this help into developing countries from developed countries. Developed countries has, I think, promise that they have to contribute with 100 million pounds.
100 billion. Yes.
Billion pounds in order to help developing countries. And the main debate is that the Paris Agreement does not make any more this distinction between what is a developing country and what is a developed country. There is a lot to do in terms of innovation, as you mentioned, Rob. There is investments there that can contribute to generate more growth out of it. And it's very important to take into consideration that in those countries, usually developing countries are more unstable in terms of socio-political context. And renewable energy are one of those technologies that allows developing countries to rely on clean energy, but also to empower populations, empower certain rural areas, empower women. So I think that's a debate that will need to be taken into COP, and certainly implement the instruments. If it's a carbon market, it's a carbon market, but instruments that help develop countries to invest in developing countries. And we shouldn't forget, and one of the things I should say, the role of green investment banks, development banks on sending the right signals for private investors to go into these countries as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, do you want to pick up that? I mean, we've had several questions around kind of a carbon price and how that's going to work.
Sure. So back in the early days of climate economics, the idea was essentially, if we could just get the right carbon price and charge it uniformly for every ton of carbon released anywhere in the world, wouldn't that just be the most efficient way of dealing with climate change? And if you make the carbon price high enough, then it will provide a sufficient disincentive to those who would otherwise emit carbon. And in many respects, that's still true to a degree, but more recent research has shown, and just a better understanding of the problems of climate change, has shown that this is not just one market failure, one externality, one piece of pollution that we have to fix. It's a whole series of interconnected market failures, challenges that prevent the market from doing the most efficient thing. And so yes, there's a carbon price, and that would be very helpful. But we also need to deal with the lock-in, the technological lock-in that we have, because our infrastructure of coal-fired power plants is dependent on fossil fuels, and it lasts for 50 years or longer. It's great news that China has just committed to ending its involvement in new coal-fired power plants around the world. But there's still huge questions. What about the ones that are already under production? There's 20 that are in production now. There's 17 that are in planning. And the big thing is, what do you do with China's domestic coal production, right? Yeah. So there are loads of various different challenges here. It's the technological lock-in, it's the carbon price, but there's also externalities and inefficiencies in the food system. And this is really important as well, because it speaks not just to climate change, but also to deforestation, to biodiversity loss, the extinction of species, and crucially, to the incidence of zoonotic disease jumps that generate illnesses in the human population like COVID-19 and SARS and MERS and bird flu and swine flu and HIV. 75% of emerging infectious diseases come from a zoonotic basis. So there's a food system issue, there's a carbon pricing issue, there's a technological lock-in issue. There are loads of market failures. A carbon price can help. It won't fix all of them. If we are going to go with a carbon price, let's make sure that we also factor in the issues of distribution and inequality that Cristina's work has articulated so clearly.
I think it's very, very important to send that message, that carbon price is one of the many instruments in the hands of governments that can be implemented. And probably it's not the one that can solve everything. We have R&D investments that government can do, government procurement. I won't get tired of saying that government procurement is a piece of the puzzle. Feed-in tariffs or deployment subsidies for new technologies, regulations. People don't like regulations, but regulations send the signal. So building codes, efficiency standards, a huge range of other instruments that can play a role in decarbonization, while at the same time allow us to reduce all those trade-offs on distribution and trying to promote competitiveness in the economies, in developed and in developing countries.
We've got a few kind of specific questions I want to get to and then open up again. So nuclear power, we're talking about carbon prices and energy technologies. The question of nuclear often comes up again. I mean, how do you think about nuclear as part of the mix?
Nuclear is a huge debate. And I think sometimes it's demonized. This is a very personal opinion. As a technology for the transition, it's clean, so it's not clean, it's non-emitting, it's a non-emitting technology, or non-emitting technology, but it generates all these problems with security and residuals that we know. I couldn't be in favor of putting in place new nuclear plants. We have other technologies that allow us to generate clean energy in the same way. The creation of a nuclear central power is more emitting than creating another type of facility, like, for example, a wind farm. But as a transition in technology, for those that are already open, for compensating or helping the dispatch of renewable energy, it can be a solution in the meantime. Not open new ones, sorry.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
The situation that we're currently in,
Yeah.
we're seeing a summer of low wind, and so we need gas as the backstop, right? That's what we're using because the renewables aren't generating enough. Would nuclear be a better backstop than gas? And we're seeing gas prices quadruple now. We're about to see that hit our energy bills this year. It's going to hit again next year. Would we be better off with nuclear, or should we be sticking with gas?
I guess it's depending on what you consider being better off. If the purpose is continue not using emitting technologies, probably yes. And in the end, you don't depend on other or the pipelines, which is part of the problem right now. But you have always this debate about the big tails, what happens in case there is an accident, this doesn't work, the residuals, and so on.
And
so
the economics,
that.
in your paper recently, nuclear was one of the technologies that the actual costs were greater than the experts predicted,
Yes.
whereas in all the other cases, the actual costs were less than the experts.
It's the only one that hasn't reduced cost that much. It's been much more stable in time.
Yeah. And it's worth just reiterating that the carbon emissions released to build a nuclear plant are massive.
Yeah.
Especially.
So I'm afraid we don't have any...
Sorry, just to clarify, because I need to do it.
Yes.
The paper is from the team of Professor Laura Díaz-Anadón. I'm not part of the paper, but I want to give the credit of the authors.
Thank you. So we couldn't really definitively answer that question, but you've heard some of the issues that are relevant. Another question, Matthew, around biodiversity and climate change. So that's come up in a couple of questions. To what extent do we look at these as kind of trade-offs or competing objectives? How do you address that question?
Sure. It's an extremely complex suite of interactions between a changing climate and the stock of global biodiversity. It's no simpler if we start looking at changes in climate and a local stock of biodiversity either. Most climate economic models, the ones like the DICE model, which Bill Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize for a little while ago, they have essentially ignored biodiversity. And biodiversity is the richness of species, the abundance of wild species, and the genetic diversity that exists within them. Biodiversity is hugely important to the economy. I think that biodiversity loss is a bigger immediate threat to the global economy than climate change. And we've seen this. The pandemic is a biodiversity loss issue. It's not a climate change issue. What is very exciting, though, is that there's a team of economists out at UC Davis in California that have created a green run of a climate model, of a DICE climate model, which integrates both the rest of nature, natural capital, and climate change. And what they show in their specifications is that actually investing in biodiversity conservation, things like protecting wetlands, protecting mangroves, marine protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, planting new forests, regenerating forests, all of these have a double benefit, both to biodiversity and to climate change. And in fact, when you couple And they did this in their model. They coupled climate policies with biodiversity policies. You can actually reduce the costs of both. And you enhance resilience. And of course, who doesn't love wild species? So it's hugely important. And I can anticipate that my biggest bugbear and criticism of COP26 will be the same as my biggest criticisms of all the previous COPs, which is that biodiversity has not been given a sufficient role. And I think that's likely to be the case again. Focusing on, sometimes what makes great climate policy makes terrible biodiversity policy, terrible water policy. We need things that do good for the environment right across the board.
That was actually part of the traditional debate with Elinor Ostrom, no? That all these challenges, all these balances are much bigger in order to fix the tragedy of the common that used to be when all the problems were local. And in local communities, you have to get engaged with a higher number of individuals, higher number of challenges and trade-offs. Yeah.
I mean, quite a lot of the questions seem to be addressing, you know, where's the kind of real energy going to come from for the sort of transformational thinking? So quite a lot of the questioners are saying, well, you know, we can see how there can be these kind of subtle and kind of adjustments that can try and produce win-win outcomes. But there's a kind of sense that really to get the groundswell of movement, you know, needed to see the sort of the real commitments that are needed, you know, people are asking, you know, where do you see that energy coming from? Do you see, you know, COP26 as a place where we might find kind of breakthroughs? Do you imagine it was going to come from kind of bottom up, from voters, consumers, activists, or, you know, is it really about, you know, just a hard, slow, complex alignment of you know, the corporate sector, governments, citizens? You know, where do you see kind of grounds for hope that we can make this transition?
If I can, I mean, I think the COP is very good to send the message, to send the signal, but it's not going to put the basis for moving on or carry on with the goals that we have to pursue. We are seeing alliances in businesses already. Businesses are very much engaged with this because they are seeing that they will face losses in their balance sheets, as Matthew has mentioned, if they don't get engaged and involved in the transition to low carbon economies. Citizens are more and more aware. We are seeing that as well in graphs, and YouGov type of surveys are reporting that people are more and more aware of these issues. So I think it has to be a combination of everything. The government needs to send the signals, and it has to communicate, and that's essential, that the transition is not going to be costly for the most vulnerable. We have the means to make it different and to avoid distributional trade-offs. If people perceive that our governance and policymakers are telling us the truth, we will engage the message and we will all transform the society. And it's not trying to be positive in a way, but I think if we communicate in the right way, it has to be a common effort. Sorry.
Thank you. And I mean, that I do want to allow Matthew to build on that. That's great. But can I put a question to you that I think does? So this is from Edward Lee, who says, money and public debt are not the limit, so Edward writes, on investment in a green economy. Every country has a central bank that's able to issue, you know, unlimited currency, Edward says. The only limit is the resources, labour, material and ideas available. The challenge is to divert those real and finite resources away from old economy towards building the new economy.
Let me agree more with the second part of that. I don't think that it is quite appropriate to say that central banks can just print unlimited funds without there being some fairly severe economic repercussions. But yes, absolutely. The money is a renewable resource in a way that biodiversity isn't. Once a species is lost, it's gone. Once we have exited our current climate equilibrium and entered a different one, we can't necessarily go back. In the same way that once you boil an egg, you can't turn it back into an uncooked egg. And there's lots of climate systems and ecological systems that are in that kind of process at the moment. We're boiling them. You're absolutely right to point out that what we need to do is shift the resources of the economy, and that includes labor, that includes our physical infrastructure, it does include our financial resources. Pension funds need to be addressing this in a really big way. And I think there are lots of things that places like the University of Cambridge can do to help that. I would like to see a world in which every university program relates somehow to climate change and biodiversity and nature more broadly. I think that when we train engineers, they should be learning how to deliver the net zero economy, not how to refine the internal combustion engine. I think when we train economists, they should be looking at how to build models that can factor in the environment rather than exclude it as an assumption. I think that when we're talking about arts and media, they should be thinking about how do we tell stories in a compelling way that can empower people to act and instill them to do so. So university degrees should be linked to this. I think that vocational training programs should be linked to delivering the net zero agenda. I think that there are loads of different entities. The previous question was about who needs to act. Is it governments? Is it business? Is it us? Well, it's all of us. I don't think that we should sit back and wait for governments to give us the answer, though, because it won't happen. We need business to take a lead. We need customers to demand it. So that's you.
And us. I mean, we're coming towards the end of our time. So I just want to finish with a question to each of you, which builds on that response, Matthew, which is really reflecting on our role, as, people working in a university as academics. The three of us are all part of the Cambridge Zero Policy Forum, so we're coming together collectively across the university to try and think through how our research, our engagement, our teaching can try and make progress. So I want you to reflect over the last, year or so, how do you feel Cristina, as in your professional life, how are you able to kind of contribute, do you feel, to the kinds of transitions that we need?
So I think thanks to a university like Cambridge and Cambridge Zero, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of different disciplines during the last year. And I think that's very important. So if we build our research on scientists, social scientists, economists, mathematicians, all together can put evidence-based policy out there and communicate with the policymakers in a way in which it's more accessible. So if we all work together, we can actually send that message to policymakers. And this is what I've been trying to do with the people I work in the last months.
I think that's a great answer. I'm not sure I have a tremendous amount to add, other than just to say that, Cambridge Zero includes over 1,000 of our colleagues across the university. And the people who are working in engineering and in materials science and in physics are working on how we can develop nuclear fusion technologies. The people in economics working on climate change and distribution. The people in history working on how have communities come together in the past to overcome collective action problems. It goes right across the university. Every college, every department has a role to play here. And I would be remiss if I didn't also flag the role of the Center for Science and Policy, Rob, where we get people from the highest levels of government coming for bespoke courses with us and speaking to people like Cristina and to me and to the others across the university to figure out what they can do in government today.
Well, thank you both. On behalf of all you watching, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Cristina and Matthew. I mean, it's been a real privilege to hear, your insights based on your research and your teaching about the kind of, the condition we're in now, the prospects for COP, the kinds of issues that, and it's been a really fascinating balance between kind of an appreciation of the complexity and the sensitivity of the issues, but also, this is not a hopeless task. There are clear roads ahead, clear ways that progress can be made, and you've done a great job, I think, at communicating that. So thank you to you both, but an even bigger thank you to you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have you join us for the last 50 minutes, so many of you on the last day of the Alumni Festival, and thank you so much for all the questions, which are fantastic, and I just apologise to those of you that I haven't had to been able to address your questions, but thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.